If there's one solid base of support that I've enjoyed throughout the campaign season in almost 30 primaries, it's been that of minority groups of this country who formed a close relationship with me and whose confidence I will never betray. I want to be worthy of your support. I'll never betray your trust. I'll try to make you proud of me, and I'll always remember your early friendship. Last year was a good one for the United States. We reached all of our major economic goals for 1977. 4 million new jobs were created, an all-time record, and the number of unemployed dropped by more than 1 million.
Most Americans consider that 1977 was a year of economic recovery. We in the Urban League cannot share that view. For Black Americans, 1977 was a year of continued depression with unacceptably high unemployment and a widening income gap. The generally dismal picture is worsened by the widespread expectations the new administration would right the balance and would accelerate Black progress based on campaign promises and commitments. Those expectations have been disappointed.
During his presidential campaign, Jimmy Carter made a lot of promises, many of them to Black Americans. Hopes were high because Carter's campaign rhetoric was viewed as a refreshing change from the so-called benign neglect of the Nixon-Ford years. In fact, there is general agreement that President Carter owes his Black constituents a special debt. Their vote provided the margin of victory for him in more than a dozen key states. After taking office, President Carter compiled a list of campaign promises. It added up to this 117-page book. More than 100 of the promises were made to minorities and the poor. Tonight, with the State of the Union message fresh in our minds, we will look at some of those promises and what the President has done to fulfill them in his first year in office. Representatives of the Black community and the administration will discuss the record. The program will be divided into 2 segments so that we can look at the issues one by one. We will be comparing the President's commitments and actions in the areas of unemployment, urban policy, and health, education, and welfare. With us, most of the program will be Stuart Eisenstadt, Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy, Carl Holman, President of the National Urban Coalition, and the Reverend Jesse Jackson, President of Operation Push. Last July, Vernon Jordan criticized President Carter for ignoring the areas of domestic policy which are crucial to Black Americans. This past Tuesday, while presenting the League's annual State of Black America report, Mr. Jordan acknowledged some progress in those areas, but said again that Black hopes had been disappointed. Mr. Holman, do you agree with Mr. Jordan that Black people in this country are still disappointed with the President?
I would say that the polls, including one recently taken here, would say that that is so. I think also people forget that Blacks also elected a great number of Democrats in the Congress, and here we have a predominantly Democratic Congress that we also are not very happy about.
Thank you. Mr. Eisenstadt, has domestic policy taken a back seat to foreign policy and other matters?
No, it hasn't. In fact, if there's been any one theme to the criticism which columnists and others have made of our first year, it's been that we've tried to do too much in domestic policy rather than not enough. So it certainly has not taken a back seat.
Thank you. During the campaign, President Carter repeatedly stated that his top priority would be the problem of unemployment. He promised a job for everyone who wishes one as rapidly as possible.
We've projected, and I think President Ford has projected too, an unemployment rate at the end of this year of about 7%, and an inflation rate that might be the same, about 7%. Obviously, this is not an acceptable goal to seek, nor one on which to base a quiescent or acceptable attitude. I think President Ford has accepted this unemployment rate as a reasonable achievement. I think this country ought not to have an unemployment rate in excess of 4.5%, 4% if possible. And with that total unemployment rate, we can achieve, I think, at the same time, an inflation rate of 4% or less. And that ought to be the very aggressive goal that we establish.
It is clear what happened on November 2nd, 1976. I think it is further clear of the decisive role that black Americans played in that process. It is further clear that this administration, during the campaign, went into black churches and to black neighborhoods, sought the black vote, and in fact got 94% of it. And during the campaign, we heard about jobs. And since that time, as I said here in July, up through that July speech, up until that time, we'd heard a great emphasis on the balanced budget, fiscal conservatism, and government reorganization. The expectations, on the other hand, from black people in America, dealt with the issue of jobs and employment, which, as this report clearly points out, is the most crucial problem today facing black America. Those expectations are disappointed, and that we think that the response to that need in the black community and a consistency with the needs and aspirations of black people as expressed during the campaign have not been met.
We know that in our free society, private business is still the best source of new jobs. Therefore, I will propose a new program to encourage businesses to hire young and disadvantaged Americans. These young people only need skills and a chance in order to take their place in our economic system. Let's give them a chance they need. A major step in the right direction would be the early passage of a greatly improved Humphrey Hawkins bill.
President Carter made many promises about jobs. Among them were achieving an unemployment level of 4% or less by the end of the first term, encouraging business to hire the unemployed through tax credits, and providing federal funds for public service jobs. Last week, the Bureau of Labor Statistics announced that the unemployment rate dropped to 6.4% in December, the lowest since October 1974. President Carter took credit for this decline. However, if we look more closely at the figures, we find the jobless rate for blacks was 12.5%, still more than twice the 5.6% rate for whites. The unemployment rate for blacks remained virtually unchanged since the beginning of 1977. In addition, while youth joblessness in general went down, black youth unemployment continued its upward spiral. 3 times as many black teenagers are unemployed as whites. To discuss the problem of unemployment are Secretary of Labor Ray Marshall and Robert Hill of the National Urban League. Secretary Marshall, some economists have said that unemployment can be traced directly to the failure of the administration to move quickly toward full employment. What do you say to that?
Well, I say that we are moving toward full employment, and I think that the targets that we've set in the Humphrey Hawkins bill are good targets, and we can meet those. Many economists don't agree with that. They think that we won't be able to get it down that low, but I'm sure that we can.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Hill, there has been quite a controversy over the whole question of unemployment figures and the fact that maybe even these figures aren't accurate. Is there something wrong with the optimism of the President and others about these figures?
Well, I think one is that we ended the year with an unemployment rate in the last half, which was highest for the whole year in the last 6 months, so that we ended up with 13% unemployment totally for 1977, which was the same as it was in 1976. We think that there needs to be much more targeting of jobs with respect to inner cities, and because we continue to have the disproportionate unemployment, we now have the highest unemployment rate in 1977 that we've ever had since they started recording statistics for blacks. So that I think that what we really need is a real commitment in terms of targeting more. I think the full employment Humphrey Hawkins is extremely important, the passage of that. But we need a double effort, redoubling the effort to target those jobs to the inner city minorities.
Now you mean target by, you mean specific
Specifically,
programs
that's right,
aimed at.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Eisenstadt, do you think the strategy as it has evolved within the administration of attacking this problem on a piecemeal basis is going to be sufficient, say, compared with some kind of overall economic strategy that might attack it on a broader scale?
Well, first of all, I rather vehemently disagree that we've attacked it on a piecemeal strategy. In the course of only being in office 1 year, we've increased the number of public service jobs more than 2 times, from 310,000 to 725,000. In the space of fiscal year 79 compared to fiscal year 77, the money we have allocated for youth jobs will go up 260%. In comparing the employment and training funds from the level we inherited to the level we are proposing in this budget, they will actually double from $6 billion to $12 billion. Our welfare reform program proposes to create well over 1 million jobs, and the President announced last night a $400 million private jobs initiative to hire the disadvantaged. In addition to that, we have strongly supported a 10% minority set-aside in the Public Works bill, which assures minority contractors that 10% of all contracts let will go to them, and that will mean $400 million, and we're well on our way to meeting that target. And we have supported a 15% minority set-aside for construction on the Northeast Corridor. So this is hardly a piecemeal attitude, and it's one that has led, I might add, to substantial improvement in black unemployment. For example, this year, overall black unemployment declined almost 1 full percentage point, and black male adult unemployment declined over 2 percentage points in a year. So we haven't done everything we are going to do or intend to do, obviously, in 1 year, but we've made a good start, and we've made a start in a comprehensive fashion.
Reverend Jackson, does that response make you feel better about the whole unemployment situation? You've been part of this coalition that has demanded better treatment for the unemployment problems.
It doesn't satisfy me because, on the one hand, we are constantly inspired by the moral tone, the openness, and the intention to do well. But the high unemployment Dr. Hill speaks of continues to rise because of a philosophical commitment to fiscal conservatism. One cannot reconcile the goal of a balanced budget with the kind of federal government leadership that's needed to stimulate the economy. Last night, the most despairing thing I heard, I mean, in spite of the 10% set-asides and other programs that represent some appeal, was an appeal to business to take the leadership in dealing with unemployment. This business community then responds and says, we don't have any confidence in you. I mean, the business community that does not have any confidence in the president cannot expect us to have any confidence in it when historically the business sector has resisted us. Only when stimulated by the government, by the tradition, if you will, of Roosevelt and Johnson and Humphrey, has it begun to move. I cannot very well depend upon a business community that resists affirmative action, that would rather invest in cheap labor markets abroad than invest in the cities, to put my faith in. We elected Mr. Carter to assume the responsibility of leadership. And I think just because of some difficulties during the first year in Congress, which is understandable, he should not fret in the face of that resistance, but rather appeal to his friends for support.
His friends being? Those
who elected him. I mean, those who elected him feel abandoned. And those who did not elect him are saying more positive things, as if he is taking his friends for granted and going for his enemies, who I think he really is not going to get under any circumstance.
Okay, let's just zero in on something that Secretary Marshall can address himself to. Do your plans within the Labor Department rely too heavily on faith in the private sector?
No, I don't think they do. I think it's important to put this whole question in perspective of what's been happening and to see what effect our programs really have had and can have. The first part of the perspective is to realize that blacks always suffer much more from unemployment than anybody else.
Black
workers,
adults as well
across
as
the
teenagers.
board. Now, one of the things that we were doing when we took office was recovering from the largest, from the worst recession since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Now, when you look at annual unemployment rates, you're likely to conceal some things that were happening. Now, if you look at what happened to black unemployment, during the first half of 1977, black unemployment continued to rise. The overall rate went from 13.5% in December to 14.3% in July. The black teenage unemployment rate rose to 40% from just over 34%. During the last half of 77, I'm sorry, black unemployment declined from 14.3% to 12.7% in December. When you average that out, you're likely to conceal that trend. That was extremely important. And of course, when we came in, we announced some programs, but it took us a while to get them started. We didn't get our stimulus package program passed until May. We didn't get the Youth Employment and Demonstrations Project Act passed until August. The President signed it August 5th. Now, I see, and the evidence indicates, that our programs began to take hold during the last half of the year, and that had a perceptible impact on black unemployment, and that we ought to look at that trend and not just what happened on the average. But it is true that it's still too high. I don't believe that we can rely exclusively on the private sector. I believe that what we ought to do with our public service employment programs and our training and work experience programs is to continue to target those on the areas of highest need, and that is predominantly on black unemployment. We intend to do that, and I think that we can have a much more important effect. But let me give you one number.
Okay, we're going to have it quickly.
All right, that during the third quarter, when our program started taking effect, over half of the growth of GNP is directly attributable to the stimulus package that President Carter introduced, and that continued. During last year, about 3.75 million people participated in our Department of Labor employment and training programs, and about 41% of those were blacks. Now, we intend to continue that in the future, and I believe that we can use these public programs.
Thank you. Let me just ask Mr. Holman quickly on the question of private sector, since the coalition is involved in the private sector to a great degree. Do you feel there's going to be adequate response on the part of the private sector to make the progress that you and others expect?
Well, I'm not certain of that, because I hear conflicting signals. I hear some business people saying, of course, we can't deal with structural unemployment and with these people on the and these kids on the margin who don't have enough skills.
Meaning employment that is
the
problem that is embedded in the system.
At the same time, they're opposed to public service employment. What the group that Jesse and Vernon and the rest of us belong to are planning to do is to meet with the business leadership, and we have asked the President if he will directly challenge the private sector people, instead of saying government is putting too many restraints on us, is regulating us too much, challenge them to see what they do intend to do, since they do provide 5 out of every 6 jobs.
Okay, quickly, will the President challenge
Yes, in
the private
fact, there will be a meeting probably in February with many of the major business executives using the program that he announced last night, which will provide on-the-job training subsidies to encourage private business to hire the disadvantaged.
Are you optimistic?
I am optimistic. In fact, they have been very encouraging in our discussions with them, and I am optimistic about their response.
Okay, quickly.
There are 2 concerns. One is priorities. Part of the sense of alienation, the kind of energy that went into energy, we thought would have gone into getting jobs and urban policy. I mean, that is what we responded to as a voting constituency. So priorities concern us. The other part of it, in terms of economic velocity, last year, of $160 billion capital investment, $32 billion went abroad, 1 out of every $5. And what that meant was some very stable jobs and some very key industries where we are. We now find ourselves in a trade-off between losing very stable steel jobs and auto worker jobs and textile jobs, and a trade-off with cedar jobs. And it is at that level that the economic philosophy of those who have the key economic posts really concern us, because we will never have the philosophy of the Secretary of Labor reconciled with some of the Office of Management and Budget people. Before we can even get to Congress, the urban policy is gutted.
Okay, thank you. Some economists have noted that part of the reason for black unemployment staying high is the failure of the cities to bounce back from the recession. In many speeches during his campaign, President Carter emphasized the need for a coordinated urban policy, one that would cope with the problems of urban decay, declining tax bases, crime, housing, and unemployment.
I think the bill that I signed this week, the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1977, will provide us with a base or a framework on which we can make substantial improvements in the urban areas. The formulae that are being put forward now, and the Congress is accepting them, will orient more and more of the rehabilitation money of all kinds to the more blighted areas of our country.
Leaks about the way the administration's urban policy is shaping up offer little encouragement for a broad urban marshal type program. Anything less than that is unlikely to reverse the deterioration of our cities. We urge the administration to commit adequate resources to an urban program targeted to the areas of greatest need. As a starter, general revenue sharing funds should be made part of the new urban package so that huge amounts of federal monies would finally go where they are most needed and not simply scattered to all local governmental units.
Over the last decade, the central cities have faced the problems of a declining tax base and fiscal binds, many going broke, in other words. None have suffered more from this trend than the minorities in the inner city. There's a concentration of blacks in the hardship cities. 60% live in low-income areas. Many critics of the previous administration charged that the city's problems and problems of blacks in them were ignored. President Carter promised to save the cities, to help them with urban economic planning. He also promised federal aid to help build new low-income housing and to provide rent subsidies. During the past year, the Carter administration has made some moves toward aiding the central cities, among them the Housing and Community Development Act. This legislation authorizes new urban development action grants to severely distressed cities and urban counties. It will also provide additional housing for low and moderate income families. In his State of the Union message, President Carter failed to outline his long-promised urban policy, but one is in the works. It is to be drawn from a study made by the Urban and Regional Policy Group, which is chaired by Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Patricia Harris. She is with us this evening. Secretary Harris, what can we expect in the urban policy package?
We can expect the development for the first time in the history of this country of a coherent urban and regional policy that will directly address the severe problems of cities in the context of the relationship of these cities to the rest of the country. First of all, I think it is fair to predict that the President, despite some people's concern about the concept of targeting, will in fact put his stamp of approval upon providing specific aid to meet the fiscal needs of cities, to deal with what is probably the primary concern of all of us who look at cities, the issue of providing jobs for people in those cities. In the report of the Urban and Regional Policy Group, we have 6 policy clusters, and the first of those is a concern for providing jobs. The second concern will be to provide that quality of stability that cities require, which will involve both the provision of housing and commercial services and stable jobs in those communities to which people can look for their economic futures. In short, I think the President will move from the down payment that he made on his urban policy with the Housing and Community Development Act of 1977, where not only did we have the Urban Development Action Grants, but we improved the formula of the Community Development Block Grant Program and increased the amount of money that is going into center cities, New York, Detroit, Chicago, El Paso, as a result of Carter administration urban policy developed in the past year, are now receiving more money. We at the Department of Housing and Urban Development have directed our housing aid to the cities, so cities no longer compete with the suburbs as they seek to increase the amount of housing available to low and moderate income people.
Okay, Mr. Holman, does that please you?
Certainly, I have said already that I am pleased to see what has happened so far in terms of the battle we had on revenue sharing before, when too much money was going to places where it wasn't needed. What does strike us and does bother us, as both Pat and Stu know, we had hoped very much to have an urban policy which would be in shape and could have been announced with some dollars at this particular point. Some subjects are popular with and some subjects are not with the Congress. We know that. It bothered us a good deal last night, some of us, that we didn't hear more said about, at the State of the Union, about the cities, and we didn't hear quite enough frontally said, in about the same way the energy problem was attacked, about the needs of blacks. I'm interested in what's going to happen in the economic planning, because the economic planning for cities and urban areas is something which blacks have largely been left out. They've been left out of the planning in most cases and the implementation. I do hope that when the new plan does come forward, it will come with an adequate reserve of funds to see to it that it's carried out.
Now, you think that despite what the Secretary just said, the fact that the President himself in his State of the Union message did not put more emphasis on the program bodes some kind of message?
The thing that we said to the President the other day is that
you mean the black leaders who met at the White House?
The presidency provides what Teddy Roosevelt called a bully pulpit. I think that in the next several months it's going to be very important that the President make it absolutely clear that what happens to our cities is for him an urgent priority, and that the people of this country must come to see it as such.
You wanted to add something?
There are some positive things about it, and I think that sometimes in the heat of these challenges, we do not want to give the impression that we are someone other than the people that elected Mr. Carter president, because we rejected Mr. Ford's policies, and when we see them, we don't like that. There are some good things about urban policy. One, it is the fundamental belief that we need one. Secondly, we're glad that the person who's in charge of it, Mrs. Harris, is in charge of it, because we feel that she's someone who we can trust and who is knowledgeable of the situation. The critical factor, now that we have a person in charge who has integrity and who has an understanding, and now that it has been recognized to be a concern, is will we have the fiscal wherewithal to, in fact, make it happen?
The fiscal?
The fiscal wherewithal, in fact, to make it happen.
Well, let's
our present reading is that the money will be far too inadequate, basically because too many people see solving the city's problem as solving the black problem, and that is unfair. There are more white people who live in cities than black people, and there are more cities involved than Newark, New York, Washington, D.C., and Baltimore. We're talking about reviving American cities, and there has never been a suburb without a city. And to that extent, as our cities go, so goes our nation.
Well, let's ask Mr. Eisenstadt about that. There have been persistent rumors that the Office of Management and Budget proposes a general reduction in HUD's budget. Now, many have also said that the greatest threat to a meaningful urban policy is fiscal conservatism. Can we save the cities and have a balanced budget?
Well, let me make 2 points. First of all, the persistent rumor was an uninformed rumor, and Secretary Harris, I think her department has probably gotten one of the largest increases of any department in government in the fiscal 79 budget, and deserved it because she's doing an excellent job and needs to have additional funds to continue that. Secondly, it's awfully important that we get beyond the emotional rhetoric of a balanced budget and listen to what the President said last night and what he has said repeatedly, what all of his economic advisors have said repeatedly, and understand what we are saying about a balanced budget. It's quite simple. We are saying that we should move toward a balanced budget in a high employment economy, and that the way you achieve a balanced budget is not by cutting back on needed resources for jobs or cities. It is to increase resources to develop jobs. The President has said that the way to achieve a balanced budget is to have a healthy economy, to put people back to work, and therefore to generate the tax revenues which permit you to balance a budget. So we're not suggesting that the way to achieve a balanced budget is at the sake of either cities or jobs. Indeed, it depends on the healthy performance of the economy and on reducing markedly the unemployment rate, particularly among minorities, to achieve that. So it's a very consistent theme.
Well, what about the consistent theme that Mr. Holman sounded about economic planning and the lack of inclusion of blacks in that planning? Is Is that something you can...
Well, I don't know. Carl is at the White House enough to almost qualify to be on the staff, so we certainly have plenty of input. Mr. Jackson has his input. We've just recently funded one of his projects that has a lot of promise in the education area. And in the housing and urban development area, as I said, under Mrs. Harris's direction, the Community Block Grant Program is getting $12 billion over 3 years. That's over a $2.5 billion increase over the existing base. And under this new action grant program that she will be administering, she has some $400 million to target and pinpoint to distressed areas.
Okay. Secretary Harris, let me just, I'll get to you in 1 second. The Wall Street Journal noted last week that cities would soon be footing the bill for unemployment. Is this accurate, and is the President going to allow this to happen?
Well, the problem of the continuation of programs that went into effect as temporary programs is one that I think will be solved by the message that is going over, I guess, today or tomorrow.
Which will say?
Well, I'll wait and let the message speak for itself. I think that the President's action will not be inconsistent with his concern to make certain that cities do not go bankrupt because of the lack of action by the federal government. But I do want to say that one of the contributions that I hope that the Urban and Regional Policy Group's proposal will be making, to relate to what Carl is concerned about, is to eliminate the simplistic notion that the problems of cities can be dealt with by an economic development proposal or an housing proposal or a particular proposal. It is imperative that there be a combination of tools used appropriately together that will deal with employment problems, with economic stability problems, and with the kind of surrounding physical environment that makes people want to live and be employed there, that makes businesses want to stay there. And there is developing a kind of interpretation of the recommended urban policy that says it is an economic development policy for business. That is what it is not. It is a policy that looks to pulling together the resources of this country in a partnership between the federal government, as the President said in his message last night, on the one side, state, local governments, and private business and neighborhoods on the other. And we will be looking for the tools that make this happen in a realistic way.
Thank you, Secretary Harris. Reverend Jackson has to move along, and we have to move along. You want to add quickly so you can...
Well, I simply want to say that as we challenge this administration to be responsive to us, we are being responsible. We owe it to ourselves. Secondly, that jobs is one of our concerns, but equity and parity is also one of our concerns. We want our share of land and wealth and insurance companies and banks and divestitures and real money as well. And a comprehensive plan must take into account those ambitions. Lastly, I would suggest that the same kind of speeches with priorities and content that the President made to get our support, those same priorities will maintain our support. A fundamental concern is now the priorities have shifted and the speeches have shifted. And our concern is that those priorities are met. And if that is met, then we find ourselves sustaining a partnership. If not, that partnership is in jeopardy.
Thank you. Black Americans make up about 11% of the population, but they comprise about 30% of the poor. As a result, one of the most crucial areas affecting the blacks is health, education, and welfare.
Amount of personal wealth should not limit the state of a person's health. Now, national health insurance alone cannot redistribute doctors or raise the quality of care. So we must plan and decisively phase in simultaneous reform of services and refinancing of costs. It's too early yet to lay down specifics on a national health insurance program. We still have a very bad circumstance in our country with an inadequate attention given to education. I see a stronger and stronger role to be played by the federal government in the financing of education. And I would also insist on the local and state governments being responsible for the management of the school system. The welfare system is too hopeless to be cured by minor modifications. We must make a complete and clean break with the past. The program that I propose today to the Congress does just that. It will provide jobs for those who need work, a work bonus for those who do work but whose incomes are inadequate to support their family. It provides income support for those who are able to work part-time or who are unable to work due to age or physical disability, or who need to care for little children 6 years of age or younger. It provides an earned income tax credit to strengthen work incentives and to provide tax relief for working families who have been hard hit by payroll tax increases.
During the campaign, President Carter made 3 important promises: to work for a national health insurance policy, to create a separate Department of Education, and to scrap the welfare system and develop a whole new framework. So far, the administration has acted in 2 of those areas: the announcement of the creation of an education department and welfare reform. The Congress has not acted on the welfare proposal, but the administration has high hopes that will be passed this spring. Basically, the new system, called a Program for Better Jobs and Income, is made up of the following elements. First, job opportunities for the unemployed. Second, cash payments or tax credits for people whose incomes are inadequate to support their families. And finally, income support for those who work part-time or can't work because of age or disability, or because they have no one to take care of their small children. With us tonight to look at these programs are Dr. Robert Hill of the Urban League and Dr. Kenneth Tollett, Director of the Institute for the Study of Educational Policy. Also with us is Henry Aaron, Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation for the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. We're going to divide this portion into segments: education and social welfare. Dr. Tollett, can you tell us what benefit for minorities would be the separate education department that President Carter talked about in his State of the Union address?
I don't really know of any, but I suppose if the President wants to do this, it would be a managerial tidying up. I think commitment to social objectives is a much more important thing than setting up a Department of Education. I'm not saying I'm against the Department of Education. I think the President has done well in the people he has named at HEW in the education section. I think he's getting good advice on education. I think where he may be falling down is that he has not expressed forcefully enough to the country the importance of dealing with the education problems in the ghetto and dealing with the education problems in higher education.
Okay.
The dilly-dallying on the Bakke case is unconscionable.
Okay, we'll get back to the Bakke case in just a moment. Let's ask Mr. Aaron what the benefits would be in a separate Department of Education for minorities.
Well, I'd like to focus a bit on the last part of the remark that was just made, because I think the record so far by the Carter administration in education has been outstanding from the standpoint of low-income people in general and from the standpoint of blacks as well.
Can you give us a couple of examples?
Be glad to. The major program of assistance to elementary and secondary education, Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, was increasing very slowly in previous years. During the first year of the Carter administration, there was a 20% increase in the grants to school districts under that program. In the area of higher education, the program of basic educational opportunity grants, a program that is income tested and goes predominantly to low-income people, that increased 25% during the first year of the Carter administration. The program of Head Start, to assist children before they enter school, experienced a 30% increase during the first year. Those are very solid accomplishments. They're dollar and cents accomplishments. They go to low-income people. They go to cities. They go disproportionately to blacks, because blacks, unfortunately, are disproportionately low income at the present time in the United States. They're a solid foundation, and I think if you look at what's going to happen in next year's budget, you'll see that we will build on that, and there will be additional major increases in each of those areas that deliver on the promises that led blacks overwhelmingly to support President Carter.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, what about on the welfare aspect of this? Dr. Hill, do you think the welfare reform package is a clean break with the past or just a reshuffling?
Well, I think that there are a number of positive features about the administration's welfare package, except when you examine it much more closely in terms of its execution. For example, it's clear that they say that we know that the poor want to work, but we still will force them to register. Also in terms of to work. And that I think that the most unworkable part, I think, is in terms of the jobs aspect related to that, because we do not think that it's highly practical that the CETA jobs, which is what they're talking about enfolding, taking the CETA jobs in terms from the localities and making those jobs available for persons on welfare is very likely at all. Frankly, we think that the jobs aspect should be just made part of the full employment. In other words, as a part of itself, because actually we have an increasing number of blacks who are poor, and it is disproportionately women who are head of families. And we think that if you have a full employment, a real commitment on full employment, that would then make it, in terms on the other side with welfare reform, I think more doable type of package.
Mr. Eisenstadt, does any of this, will any of this factor into any consideration, policy considerations on the part of the President? Any of those concerns?
We have, as I've indicated before, a very rapid increase in the number of jobs that we intend directly and indirectly to stimulate. The issue of welfare reform is now before Congressman Corman's committee in the House, and I hope that some of the efforts of Dr. Hill and other groups will be directed not at this point toward the administration, which has already proposed it, but rather toward the Congress, which needs to pass it.
Mr. Holman, what is your feeling about that as a resident Washingtonian and Hill watcher?
Well, as Stu Eisenstadt well knows, our task force had suggested that perhaps they were trying to do too much by trying to do a comprehensive rather than incremental kind of welfare reform, because so many of us had gone through this battle over FAP, and we saw.
When you mean incremental?
Just as the cashing out food stamps was just doing it by one part, but that became a very major and important step to have taken, because it removed a number of the kinds of barriers that poor people had to deal with before. I quite agree that the problems now are problems on the Hill, and I return to what I said earlier about the fact that we very well know that we have a problem also with a number of Democrats and Republicans on the Hill who were elected by some of these same constituencies. And we are going to bog down on welfare reform again unless we not only deal with the structural problems of what may be proposed, but we try to find out if two things are going to happen. One, are we going to get a constituency group in the Congress that will really support welfare reform rather than mouthing about it? And secondly, will the private sector really take those people who have come out of these job training programs and put them to work?
Well, one of the components of the welfare plan is that the jobs created will only last 12 months for an individual worker, and then he'll have to go out and look for another job in the private sector. Mr. Aaron, what kind of thinking has gone into the possibility that this person won't be able to find a job?
The motivation for that provision was to try and encourage people to move into the private sector as rapidly as possible. I think that that's an important aspect of the program. The long-run solution to the problem of employment for low-income people, black or white, as well as for middle or upper-income people, in the end is going to be employment in the private sector. I'd like to recur, though, to a point that Mr. Holman made. One thing that we've really been struck by throughout this process is how willing people were to use the administration's proposal as the focus for discussion. Various people disliked one part or another of the proposal and wanted to modify it. But they agreed that this was where the ball game was.
You mean in
politically,
the general, yeah.
That they might want to modify it in various respects, but that the really important thing was that in order to get welfare reform, it was vital to prevent precisely what Mr. Holman referred to, namely things bogging down. The subcommittee in the House of Representatives has made certain modifications, some of which we agree with and some of which we don't. But we see the vital ingredient to successful welfare reform is to continuing this process, to moving on to the next step. We're pleased with the progress so far, and we expect possibly other changes to be made.
Okay. President Carter has repeatedly, Mr. Eisenstadt, promised support for a national health insurance program. I think he referred to it in the State of Union message.
Yes,
I can't remember. Where is it and what's happening with it?
We are now working on it in conjunction with the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and we hope to have a piece of legislation to the Congress before the end of this session.
Mr. Holman, that is something that Mr. Jordan mentioned in his State of Black America as being important to Black Americans. Why is it so important?
Well, it must seem to some people, that's why Vernon and the rest of us keep saying that many of the things that are true of blacks are also true of poor whites, that we're constantly saying blacks suffer more than anyone else in terms of these things. In terms of health care, the cost of health care, and in the cities that I've visited, the fact that health care units are moving out of the central city and toward the edges and periphery of the cities, these are real problems. And since the cost is so great, some kind of national health insurance is about the only glimmer of light in the darkness for poor people, especially. When rich people and well-off people are complaining about health care costs, you know what the problem is for poor whites and poor blacks and poor Chicanos and Puerto Ricans.
Are you optimistic from what you hear from the other side of the platform that one is in the works and is going to be out pretty
I think one is in the works. I think everybody knows it's going to cost money, and also there is a battle going on, again, in terms of the private sector dispensers of health care. We're not so sure that they want a certain kind of national health care package.
Right, thank you. We're focused largely on the promises that President Carter has made, but as he himself has learned, there are problems in turning promises into policy and policy into legislation.
As you know, we have issued what I believe is a complete book of my campaign promises, which is, I presume, being made available to all of you. My determination is to keep all those promises. Obviously, if circumstances should change, I would have to reserve the right to go back to the American people and say, now that circumstances have changed, this is a better approach to that particular problem. But I will do my utmost to keep all the campaign promises that I made to the American people. Well, I think my biggest mistake has been in inadvertently building up expectations too high. I underestimated the difficulty and the time required for Congress to take action on controversial measures. It's much easier for me to study and evolve and present legislation to the Congress than it is for them to pass it in its final form. And I've dashed some hopes. Government cannot solve our problems. It can't set our goals. It cannot define our vision. Government cannot eliminate poverty or provide a bountiful economy or reduce inflation or save our cities or cure illiteracy or provide energy. And government cannot mandate goodness. Only a true partnership between government and the people can ever hope to reach these goals.
During the campaign, President Carter promised to work for universal voter registration and to have an open-door policy at the White House. Many have passed through the portals of the House at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, but as he just indicated, the President has had difficulty opening some other doors. The American political system is such that the promises one man makes, even the President, mostly depend on their fulfillment on many other people. Paramount among them are the public officials elected to carry out the will of their constituencies, the Congress in this case. The process is not always simple. It is sometimes baffling, even to a president. With us tonight to look at why and what to do about it are Congresswoman Yvonne Braithwaite-Burke, former chairperson of the Congressional Black Caucus, William Cable of the White House Congressional Liaison Office, and Vernon E. Jordan, Jr., president of the Urban League, who has battled foul weather to join us. Mr. Eisenstadt, the President said in his message that government can't do everything. Is that a way of backing away from the commitment he's made to minorities?
The State of the Union speech was, I think, quite eloquent in indicating the fact that the government had to do more for the disadvantaged, that we had to do more to lower those barriers which exist to the hiring of the disadvantaged, black, Chicanos, and others, and it in no way signifies a backing away. What it signifies is the realistic fact that government alone can't do it, and indeed that is why Mr. Jordan and Mr. Holman and their organizations are working with the private sector to encourage them to cooperate with government in what we called a new partnership. And what the President called for last night was a new spirit of partnership between the private sector and the public sector. So it is not in any way a backing away. It is a recognition of the fact that these problems cannot be solved alone, but must be solved through a partnership of the private sector and the governmental sector.
Thank you. Mr. Jordan, do you think that your expectations and those of minorities were too high?
No, I don't. I do not believe that the matters of simple justice, the matters of equity, the matters of fairness, or in fact expectations that are too high. I think that they are, especially as relates to black people, justified aims and aspirations. So no, I do not.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Cable, President Carter is continually passing the blame onto Congress and saying that they don't act. Is that a fair assessment?
No, I don't think that's a fair assessment at all. If you look at the record, the Congress has completed action on 3/4 of the legislative proposals that have been sent up there in the first session. We sent a lot of things up. A lot of things are going to take a lot of time. Congress is criticized if they pass everything as being a rubber stamp, and when they don't pass everything as quickly as we might like, they're recalcitrant. I think we've got a pretty good balance between in our relationships with the Congress.
Congresswoman Burke, do you buy that?
Well, Congress is a battle. One of the real problems that the Black Caucus must face is that in every 2 years that entire Congress runs and that House runs for re-election. And we get caught often in political conflicts. But we find a greater sensitivity within the House to the real needs of blacks in this country. And also you've had a change in the participation of black members in the House. More members are now chairmen or subcommittee chairmen or women of committees. And one of our great hopes with the Hawkins-Humphrey bill is created by the very fact that we have Congressman Hawkins, who is the chairman of that subcommittee, so that we find in many instances that we have to be fighting at every forefront within the House with the administration to try to get results, and it's just not easy.
Do you have access to the administration?
I have.
As black representatives?
I believe that the administration has been responsive. Unfortunately, that responsiveness came so late in last year, probably just from the reality of so many demands on the administration. But before those hard meetings could start taking place, the year was almost over. So that now we're in a situation that we're going to have to be trying to get legislation passed during an election year, which means it's doubly difficult.
Right. Reverend Jackson had to leave us, but he is urging blacks to the unregistered black voters in this country to consider the Republican Party as an alternative. Mr. Holman, what do you think of that position?
I can't speak for Jesse Jackson. He speaks very eloquently for himself. I think that as a Democrat, that it does make sense for healthy competition if you can get healthy competition in the United States. However, what I have been looking at has said to me that very often the Democrats have taken black voters for granted, and looking at the way some of the Republicans have treated the black Republicans already in their ranks, it's going to be an interesting ball game to see if that can work out. But surely, if you can get that kind of healthy competition, it increases our options.
Mr. Eisenstadt, okay.
To say something. I think that what too few people don't understand is that the black vote, in my view, is not wedded to any one party or to any one candidate. That the black vote votes its interests, its aspirations, its needs, its rage. And it is clear upon analysis, for example, that black people vote for Javits, they vote for Charles Mathias, they vote for Chuck Percy, they voted for Winthrop Rockefeller. It is also clear, if you would look at the 1964 presidential election and gubernatorial election in the state of Arkansas. The black vote went almost 98% for Democratic President Lyndon Johnson, but it went almost 90% for a Republican candidate in Arkansas, Winthrop Rockefeller. So that it is clear that, to me, that when race is a primary issue, as it was in the '64 campaign, presidential campaign, the black vote polarizes. Where race is not an issue, it proliferates. Had the contest in '64 been between Lyndon Johnson and Nelson Rockefeller, I doubt very seriously that it would have been as lopsided as it was.
Okay, I might add that the point is it wasn't between those two, and the reason it wasn't between those two was because the right wing of the Republican Party controls that party. Everybody on this platform knows that they did and that they do, and that that is the mainstream of thinking of the Republican Party. There is no one in the administration and no one in the Democratic Party who takes any votes for granted. The president worked very hard for the black vote. He stumped for it. We feel he earned it, and we feel that he's trying to fulfill the commitment to it. But to indicate that there is a realistic alternative in the Republican Party as it is now constituted, I think really is just not accurate.
Well, do you feel that
we've gone through 8 years of that, and we saw what happened.
Except that black people, in their own judgment on election day, whether it's state, local, or national, will have to make that determination. And I have great faith, as has been demonstrated by black people in their participation in the elections, that they will continue to exercise with care how to, in fact, use their ballot.
Do you think, very quickly, that this move, though, towards the Republican Party, even a recommendation, bodes ill for
there
the
is
Carter
no move
administration?
toward the Republican Party. Every poll taken shows that there is no move. They have 18% of the American public support, which is about the percentage one would expect given the ideological stands to the far right that they take. There is no move. I don't expect a move. We are going to continue to be sensitive to the concerns of black America and poor America, which is the history of the Democratic Party.
Okay. This concludes our look at President Carter's promises to black Americans and how some of them view his progress in fulfilling them. Obviously, there are gaps, as this dialogue has indicated, but at least there has been a dialogue, and we hope you have become more informed through it. Thank you all. This is Charlene Hunter-Galt. Good night.